It's always a tricky thing to be like, hey, let's talk about losing someone and now let's learn together. But I really want us to be open today to the things that God wants to teach us. And last week we started a new series, but before I kind of give a bit of a recap, if you missed last week, I want to ask you a simple question. Like, what's the hardest thing you ever asked somebody to do? Just think about this. What's the hardest thing you ever asked somebody to do that you can remember? If you ask somebody to marry you, it's a hard thing to do. The hardest thing you ask someone to do, you're like, I'm going to ask you, but I don't know, like maybe you could do this, the hardest thing. One of the hardest things I ever asked somebody to do was, I asked a friend of mine to drive me to the airport at 3:30 in the morning in the middle of a snowstorm. Any of you? How many of you say I would do that? I would do that for my friend. How many of you? I just need faces just in case I need help one day. That person stopped being my friend. Okay, so. No, but there's a sense like you ask people some stuff and you're like, okay, I'm going to ask you something, and you preempt the asking by preparing them, right? Like, what I'm going to ask you is really going to be hard, and if you're going to say no, I understand, but I thought you were my friend, and and you get ready and then you ask, and then you hope they say yes. And in some ways that moment is a reflection of how close they are to you, and in some ways you're like, oh, I hope this works. But all of us have moments in life where we ask people to do something that's challenging. And also then we have other moments in life where we have to learn that God in the Bible is a God who also asks us to do certain things we don't want to do. So I want to ask you this question second, which is, when's the last time God asked you to do something difficult? When's the last time you sensed that God was maybe calling you to do something that you're like, I don't know, like that's going to be too hard. I don't want to do that. Now I know some of you right now, you're thinking, I don't know, like I don't even know how to listen to God speak, or I'm not sure how that works. And that's okay, we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning. Sometimes it's very hard to discern exactly what it looks like when God calls us to do something. But can you think of a time when you felt like, I think God is asking me to do this and I don't really know what the next step is? Or some of you think of like the scariest thing God could ever ask you to do. Some of you know my wife and I, you know that one of the scariest things my wife hoped that God would never ask her to do was to move to Quebec and live here. She lost. And I remember when I was younger and trying to learn about Christianity, one of the most difficult things I was afraid that God was going to ask me to do was to tell one of my close friends that I went to school with in Cégep. I was studying music at Vanier, and Vanier music crew are like wonderful and weird all the same time. Like the people at Vanier, any Vanier people, you ever walk by the music corridor and like their music people are lying down on the floor, they have no friends? Yeah, that was a lot of my friends. So it's musician vibe, We're just hoping somebody will feed us. It's kind of, we practice to be in the metro. Anyway, so some of you got that, some of you, don't worry about it, just don't worry about it. Okay? Is that I remember when I was in music school, I had one of my good friends, we had been friends for a while, he was like a great musician, and we were close, and I felt like it's very hard to be close to somebody for too long until you really tell them really who you are, right? Like the full picture of like. And one day I just sensed quietly, God was like, hey, when are you going to tell your friend that I'm your friend? I'm like, never. I'm like, I'm not doing that. Like, it's going to be so weird. And so I'm like, that can't be God, that he would, like, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm not talking about, like, God with him. Like, we're musicians, we're men hug, we grunt, we don't talk about God. And so we kept going, and I quietly had a sense. God was like, hey, when are you going to tell your friend, who supposedly is your friend, about the fact that we're friends, me and you? I'm like, I can't do this. And then there ended up a situation in my friend's life where he experienced something really horrible happen in his life, and we were talking, and he was sharing this with me, and he's like, Dom, I don't think there's anyone else I would share this with. And I realized, I'm like, there's stuff that I feel like I need to share with you too. And he's like, really? I'm like, wow. I said, sometimes I make different decisions about where we're gonna hang out, or how I act, or how I speak seems different. It's cause like a while ago, God has really changed my life, and I've been growing. And he's like, wow, like, why did it take so long for you to tell me that? I'm like, I don't know. And he's like, aren't we friends? I'm like, yeah. But there was this thing in me that I felt that was gonna be so overwhelming to tell him, and he was like, oh, that's fine, that's great. We have moments in our life where God asks us to do something and it feels so big and overwhelming, and he's like, just try. Just see what it's like if you just trust me with this. And begin to see what I do when you just trust me with the decision you have to make. One of the most difficult things I think that people experience today that God asks them to do, maybe this has been your experience, it was for mine, forget about talking to my friend. The most difficult thing was to begin to give financially to the church. That was a big deal for me. Even to just start to contribute to God's work, I was like, oh, this is sketchy. Who's using the money? How does that work? Like, there's these moments in our lives where God has these little promptings and he says, hey, like, would you just trust me in this and begin to do this? The last thing I can remember that was the most difficult thing that I had to do is when God said, hey, you and your family are going to leave where you are, and I'm going to use you to start a new church. And some of you know that, and that's how the 180 kind of started, with some great people and great friends. So along the way in our life, God has moments where he finds us and he asks us, hey, what are you willing to do? You really trust me enough to do something that you don't feel like you're going to do? Now that's really hard for people, because most people's view of God is that God comes to help stuff that you already want to do. That's most people's view of God in the world, right? Like, I want a business, and that's what I want to do, and I hope God blesses what I want to do. But if you read the Bible and you learn about God, one of the most beautiful things that God does is he invites us to do things that we never know how we're going to do them. He invites us to step into moments that we really don't know how they're going to work out. He invites us to trust him in ways that we're like, I don't really know how this is all going to come together. And he's like, well, just trust me and see what I do now. Just see how I stretch you and see how I provide more than your wildest dreams. And you know what? I think there's a generation of people that are growing up now, and they're dying for role models and parents who are going to model this for them. They're dying for what it looks like for us to say to them, hey, this is what it looks like when you really learn to trust Jesus. And there's this person in the Bible that we've been looking at, started last week. His name is Hosea. And if you weren't here, this is a person in the Bible that's really going to struggle with the fact that God is going to ask him to do something insane. Like, completely radical. I mean, and this is a story about love and sex and passion and lust and all this. And some of you are like, if you don't have a Bible, you're like, that's in the Bible? Yeah, it's in the Bible. It's pretty edgy. It's this insane book and this story of this guy called Hosea. And if you were here last week, maybe you remember this, but Hosea was asked to do something that, one of the most difficult things that God says to Hosea. He says, you know what I want you to do, Hosea? I want you to be a mouthpiece and a messenger to my people. And my people that I need you to speak with are not going to listen to you anymore, okay? So just think, I mentioned this last week, if you're a parent and you have kids, think about asking them to do something and they ignore you. Any of you, the feeling? Yeah? So multiply that by 1,000. So God asks his people to do something, they're like, whatever, we don't care. So God says, Hosea, enough with the speaking. I want you to do something with your life that's going to be a symbol to the people, my people who are ignoring me, about how I feel about how they're living, okay? And God asks Hosea to marry a prostitute. Okay, you're like, when you read this letter, you're like, what the heck? And some translations, somebody was making fun of me last week. They're like, Dom, did you say the word whore from the stage at church? I'm like, it's in the Bible. We're just breaking it down. It's there. Because Hosea is told by God to go and marry a woman who's promiscuous, who's a prostitute, who sleeps around, as a symbol of what it looks like to God for his people and how they're living. The symbolism was God saying, I want the people to know that to me, the way they're living is as if they're prostitutes in my kingdom. They don't care about me anymore. They're just going to use me and use whoever they find for themselves. And so if you want to make it simple, here's just an image. Like God, you can go to like God equals Hosea, and Gomer, this woman, the wife, equals Israel. Okay? Just easy. This is like the code. If you don't have this code, the book makes no sense. Okay? It's like the Rubik's Cube code. And the whole book is built around this idea. That God says, Hosea, as you live out what I'm going to ask you to do now, I want people to get a glimpse of what it looks like for them to have, not only that they ignored me, but that I'm still paying attention to how they live, and I'm going to call them back to myself. Right? And Gomer, which is an interesting name, is the wife who's promiscuous, represents the people of God. The people who found a way to keep following all the rituals of religion and yet ignore God's voice in their life. Ever happened to you? It's easy to just practice I'll go to church once in a while, maybe I'll help, but I'm never giving God my heart. Like, I'll just do all the external things. It'll look great. Like, I'll sing with my hands up, and maybe I'll help. But like, God, just stay out of this part of my heart. That's mine. Like, you're not getting that. That at some point, God says, you can stop all the rituals, you can stop all the activity, I don't care. I actually am paying attention to what's going on in your heart. And this is the great picture that I introduced to you last week in the book of Hosea. You can read the book, it's a beautiful book. But then it gets even more complicated. You can go to the next picture, because God tells Hosea, you should have kids. Okay, you should have some munchkins. And so basically Hosea and Gomer get married, and they have 3 children, okay? And the blessing of having children backfires. There's this backfire of the blessing in this sense that all the children that they have are given a special name. And I'm not going to re-preach last week's sermon, okay? All the children are given a symbolic name that represents how God sees his people. Like, and one of the names is like, you're not my people anymore, for all the kids. How many of you like the cool shoes thingy? Yeah? Shoes? No? No one? None of you like that. Okay, I'm not doing that anymore for any of you. So that's the picture that I left off last week. And one of the profound things you need to feel in the story is that in the Bible, if you were a promiscuous woman, almost like today, it was very rare for someone to say, will you marry me? It was a very common practice that if a woman was promiscuous, she often worked maybe in the context of a religious temple. Temples had prostitutes sometimes and women who slept with people as part of worship, which is the Bible's profound, complicated world that we learn about, right? But there was moments where Hosea was trying to tell Gomer, I don't want you to live this way anymore. I'm actually going to marry you. Like, we're going to be together. And Gomer would be in a relationship, they would have a child, and then she would go on back to living her life, and then she would come back, and she would go back and forth. And so this is one of the profound things that I think you need to understand. If you forget everything else, remember this, that Gomer tasted of the love of Hosea and eventually didn't care anyway. Okay, you need to remember that Hosea is a representation of God saying, even after you've tasted my love and you've tasted my blessing and you've tasted of how I want to care for you, you still began to ignore me. As I was studying this week, I thought of times in my life where that's happened to me. Where God's like, I've given you a glimpse that I'm going to provide for you, and I've given you a glimpse of the things that I have in store for you, and I want to help, and I want you to understand that there's a peace and a hope that comes in a relationship with me. And then I've had times in my life where I knew that in my head, but I'm like, I'm going to do my own thing. I don't really care. I mean, it's great. Somebody told me a story in the Bible. That's great. Like, you go to church, but I don't really care. And it might sound weird because now you see me as a pastor, and you're like, really? Like, there were times in my life where I had seen God do special things, but I still wanted to live my own life. I didn't care. I thought this was good for somebody else, not for me. And oftentimes God calls us and he invites us to be obedient. And Hosea is a prophet in the Bible who has to be obedient. And so think about it this way. Israel is disobedient. Hosea is obedient. Hosea is going to model what it looks like when you respond yes to God's calling. Hosea is a picture of what it looks like when we say yes to the things that God is calling us to. And Israel is a picture of what it looks like when we say, God, we love your blessings in our lives, but we don't really care that much. Like, it's not that important for us to really give you our hearts. We're just going to use you when it works in our favor. You see this whole picture of how the book works? That Gomer represents how easy it can become for us to think that God is someone that we could use just for when it benefits us. And there's a pattern that develops in this book that Gomer comes and goes into her home, back and forth, whenever it's advantageous for her to have a relationship with Hosea, then she goes back, then she comes back. Now, how many of you think you would have the courage to be in that kind of relationship? Think about it. How many of you would be like, if one of your friends told you, hey, you know what? This is what's happening in my marriage. I think my wife is cheating on me, and we had our first son or daughter, and I'm not sure if I should stay with her. How many of you would be like, just give her a chance. That stuff happens. Just shake it off, bro. How many of you? Huh? Okay, so then let's say we do that together. We say, bro, just shake it off. It's 2020. That's what people do sometimes. You got to work it out. They have the internet and all this stuff, right? So you meet for coffee again. He's like, bro, you remember you told me to shake it off? I did. And guess what? She did it again? You're like, yeah, like she did it again. I don't know who the guy is, but you know, we had this second child and now she's not living at home anymore. How many of you would be like, it's okay, bro, like that's life, it happens. You know, you just gotta shake it off. How many at that point you would be like, bro, you gotta hit her with your car now. Now you gotta go to that level. Let's go to the level of like, you gotta make it look like an accident, but like it's not gonna work. To get to the place where you're like, hey, just try it again. Hey, just forgive her and try it again. You could feel the anxiety of the story of like, what? And God's regularly in the book of Hosea talking about how serious this is and how much it breaks his heart to see his people live this way. Okay, this is important that you feel that. Because many people who read books in the Bible like Hosea get confused because they're like, oh, it sounds like God's going to punish them and he's so mean and that's why I'm not a Christian because God gives us rules and we can't do what we want. That's not how the book works. If you read the letter of Hosea, it's this love story between this couple that's symbolic of this beautiful other love story that God is weaving together for his people that still is relevant today. It's still about how easy we can have access to God on our terms and use God when it's going to work. And then when we're done, we can go off and do our own thing with all kinds of other things we want to do, and then come back and be like, oh, I hope it works out. And then back and forth, back and forth. Now, at one point in chapter 2 of Hosea, it gets really even more complicated in the sense that Hosea's kids are old enough now, and they're involved in how they're going to deal with their mother, Gomer. I mean, this is like serious. And this is what it says in chapter 2. It says this: rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she's not my wife, and I'm not her husband. Let her remove the adulterous look from her face. In the ancient world, you would put a certain makeup color to say you're available to someone. Otherwise, I will strip her naked and make her as bare as the day she was born. I mean, this is like, wow. This week I was with my kids, and they are upstairs in their class. Like, one of the activities that they're learning is how to get a Bible and read through their lessons. So if your kids are upstairs, one of the things you can encourage them to do is we send out like a little Bible lesson. And so one of the things I had to do, and they did it a few nights ago, is we had a Bible. We have a few Bibles in our house, and we made them look up a passage in a Bible, like in the book. They're like, wow. They're opening it up, they're like, their pages. And one of my sons like, Dad, why are the pages so like thin? I'm like, well, it's a long story. So they're interacting, and they're going through the book, and we picked just a passage for them to practice looking up. And in my head, I'm thinking, let's not ask them about Hosea. Because if they get to this part with like the second chapter where God's like, I'm going to strip your breasts bare, and I'm going to make you naked. And you're like, okay, let's not read that part. That part's not it. So let's skip that. For many of us, I think that when we don't learn that the Bible's this raw book of God's passion and love and seriousness, we can forget that at this point, God says the sin in my people is so real that it's almost like the kids now know what's going on in the parents' marriage. How many of you grew up that when things were bad, the kids are set aside? Do you ever have that relationship, that talk? If you've ever been married or you have grandparents, or you know that there's things you talk about in front of your kids and things you try to not talk about in front of your kids, right? It's just a practice. And you feel at this point in the letter where it's like, no. Let's get the kids in here. Let's just tell them how you're living. Let's tell them. Pull out your phone. Show us some pictures where you were last night. Show us. Come on. Let's get on the projector at the church. Let's do that. Would you be like, oh my God, keep it down, Hosea, keep it down. I was here before the boys woke up. I was back home on time. No. Let's just talk about it. You know why this is so important in the letter? Because Gomer represents what it's like when we think we can hide things from God. When we think that if it doesn't hurt other people and we're doing what we want, it's okay. And yet Hosea is saying, no, the kids know now, and the kids now are going to be part of the rebuking. They're going to start to talk to you too. They're going to start to emphasize that how this is going to work is not going to continue much longer. Have you ever tried that? Moments in your life where you're like, I'm doing something in secret, like it's nobody's business. I hear people say that all the time. I meet people all the time, and I'm like, you know what? How you should live and what you should do, and they're like, you know what? If it's not hurting anybody, you mind your own business. I was driving my kids to school this weekend on the radio. There was this debate they were having on the radio. I don't even know what station, but they were debating whether it's right for a person to tell someone who's jaywalking or crossing red light, with their phone, right? If we should have the right to tell people that they shouldn't do that or stop them from crossing the street on a red light. How many of you think you should mind your own business? Come on. How many of you would get offended if somebody said, hey, it's a red light, relax, slow it down? You would get offended? How many of you say, mind your own business, bro? Or sister? I don't know, opposite of that? You would. We all live by this principle. You know what it is? It's like, what I want to do is none of your business. If I'm not hurting anybody, leave it up to me, right? That's kind of the universal practice of the world, except in the Bible. In the Bible, we're introduced to this idea that's so foreign to us that there's things that we do that even though it looks like it's just about us, it actually is hurting other people as well. And in the book of Hosea, we're given this picture now where her kids and the people of Israel are going to pay, like this whole community now is going to suffer. And this violates the way we think about relationships. I remember when I was young with my brother and I always thought of tricks and ways that we could trick our parents to do stuff they didn't want us to do. And we had this great plan one day. So we decided we wanted to go play in the park that was across the street from our house. And so we left, and my dad said to us, hey, dinner's an hour. I need you to be home like at 6 o'clock. Right? So it makes sense? So we're like, okay, Dad, we're going to put on our watch at 6 o'clock. We'll be back. And so we went to play, and we started to love with the friend. Our friends showed up to play. We're playing, and it's like 5:45, and we're like, okay, we got to leave here at about like 5:50 to be back home at 6 o'clock. That's what we did, right? And then we started to get fun, and our friends were showing up, and it's like, we just want to stay a little bit longer. So my brother had an idea. He's like, how about we just take our watches and we just move them back 10 minutes at the same time? So when we get home, we'll just tell Dad, we'll walk in as if it's 6 o'clock. And be like, hey, Dad, it's 6 o'clock, right? And we'll walk in. And so we did that. Foolishly, we did that. Okay? So we were walking back. We're doing the fast walk. Okay, we're going to be like, we're like doing our watch thing. We're doing our watch thing. We finally get home. My dad's sitting at the table and he's already eating, which means we are so dead, okay, in our culture. Meaning he doesn't wait for us to eat, which was the symbol of it all. And so he gets up, he doesn't talk to us, and he goes outside, and he gets kind of this little thing that he used to hit the flies with. And I don't remember what happened after that. I have no idea. I woke up a week later, and I don't know. That's what happened. Like something happened between that and like I went blank. I'm kidding, but it got serious. We just thought it'd be so funny if we can trick our dad. He won't know. The book of Hosea, the people of Israel think they can trick their father. They think we can just keep doing all the sacrifices that God wants us to do. He won't mind if we keep prostituting our lives and living a totally different way Monday to Saturday. We were at church on Sunday. We brought our gifts, we did our worship, we burned some incense, we did all stuff. Our heart is our business. God needs to leave us alone. Hosea's like, that's not how this relationship works. God wants all of you. And the relationship of this marriage between Hosea and Gomer was meant to show that. That God wants the intimacy and the brokenness and the rawness and the pain of that relationship. And this continues in the story. And at one point we're told that this happens next. It's profound. It says this: I will not show my love to her children because they are the children of adultery. Their mother has been unfaithful. She said, I will go after my lovers who give me my food and my water and my wool and my linen and my olive oil and my drink. At one point, Gomer, which is the picture of Israel, which is, by the way, the picture of us, decides, you know what, like, I'm just going to keep doing my thing and it's not going to be a big deal. The consequences are not that bad. And God says the consequences are so bad that even your kids are going to feel them. The next generation and the next generation and the next generation, they're going to experience what it's like that you think being disobedient is just fine. I mean, this is a really strange idea for us. Because a lot of us are like, I don't want my kids to suffer for anything I did. That's like the typical thing. No, don't hurt them, hurt me. God's like, that's not how this works. That there's things that you're going to do, and you're going to practice, and you're going to have habits and things you're going to live into that sooner or later are going to either impact your family and those you love in a positive way. We all know this. We all want that. Or they're going to impact them in a negative way. And so Hosea makes that a spiritual issue. Hosea makes that a very spiritual issue. What if this is a spiritual thing that God says there's consequences spiritually if you think you can live the way you want to live? What are some of those consequences? And we feel them today where we're trying to convey with our kids. You know how hard it's going to be to tell kids that God loves them if we never model that God loves us? It's impossible. I've said this before and I'll say it again, and I heard it years ago, that the way we understand our faith and the way we learn about God is not something you can teach, it's something that's caught. It's not something that's taught, it's something that's caught. And I meet so many people, they're like, oh, I did all this for my kids and I brought them to church and I did this. I'm like, did you model any of this at home? Did you practice any of this with your kids and help them to see what it was like that you were learning to trust Jesus every day? Did you do that? They're like, no, I just dropped them off at the church. They're going to do it like we're at Garderie or something. That's it. That's really what happens. In a previous church I was at, our church was next to a super Walmart. We had parents who would drop off their kids to church and then go shopping at Walmart. And some of you are like, oh, but some of you would probably do it too. If there was a Walmart, they're building a Walmart on the streets soon, you're going to see. No, I'm kidding. It's so easy to think like, can't somebody else fix it? Like, if you fix this and I'm going to go, and the Bible's like, no, this is something you have to live into. You have to model and show them that it matters. If you don't believe me that this is a challenge of the next generation, buy Pastor Mateo lunch. As he's trying to sort out how we love the next generation and how we help them and how we listen to their questions and how we answer their doubts and be like, but you know what? The most important thing, just watch how we're learning to trust Jesus. Just see what we're learning to do. There's consequences when we think that, oh, somehow like it's just about me and my kids are going to figure it out and the Lord's going to protect them. It's going to be fine. No. What we do now will affect them. Let me give you kind of more of a general consequence of how this works. This is in Germany. There was this story that happened a few summers ago. It said this: German kids are drowning because parents are on their phones. This is what lifeguards were warning in Germany. Can you imagine this? Being at a pool and seeing lifeguards saying, listen, we've noticed this new trend as lifeguards, that as we're watching kids, that before parents used to help us with their kids, that now their parents are on their phone, and I'm not picking on anybody, like that would be me maybe, right? I'm like, oh, I gotta answer, people from church emailed me, right? I gotta do that. But how easy we get distracted of things around us, and the consequences don't feel real. They feel like, oh, this is gonna happen to someone else, not to me. And the book of Hosea is like, there's consequences whether you see them or not yet. They're real. They are very real. And God says to his people, this is the story of Israel in the Bible, that the next few months and years will be so consequential for them that another nation, which I'll tell you about next week, they're called the Assyrian nation. It's a whole other nation. It's going to come and it's going to take them as slaves because of how they've lived. I mean, it's just a book that you're like, this book is crazy. How is this in the Bible? Like, I never thought of it like this. There's consequences to the way we live. When I was young, I felt that the consequence was just about whether I go to heaven or hell when I die. And you learn about that? The consequence is like, oh, I hope I'll say a little prayer before I die, like when I'm getting sick, when I'm close to the end, right? And the Bible's like, no, there's actually consequences now that you'll experience if you think that you could just live life your own way and not trust the things that I'm calling you into every single day. This is a hard thing to learn, and it's a hard thing to practice. But the next part of Hosea, this is what we're told. Still, Gomer will chase after her lovers, but not catch them. She will look for them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go back to my husband, as at first. For then I was better off than now. She has a moment of realizing that obviously it's better with God. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, the oil, who lavished on her the silver and the gold, which they used for Baal. I just want to mention a little thing here that might be confusing, is that Baal in the Bible is the name of the gods, one of the gods that represents many gods that the people of Israel worshipped or lived around that other people worshipped. And so Hosea is saying, like, basically what Gomer has done and what so easily happens is that we start to just chase. We chase other things. So many other things will make us happy, so let's just chase them. We chase after this or chase after that. And you just realize, like, the way our lives, sometimes if we're not careful, we can chase things and look back and be like, I can't believe I was chasing that. What's one thing in life that you chased and you look back now and you regret that you chased that? How many of you remember chasing a person to be in a relationship with and they said no? How many of you remember chasing just that right job? When I get that job, I'm going to be so happy. And then you get it and you're like, oh my gosh. All of marketing in our culture is built on this idea that if only you chase that one thing, you will be happy when you get it. Just chase it. It's there. Just don't worry about it. Just go after it. This is something that's so powerful that we can taste it when we see it, so that it gets tricked into us. So I'll give you an example. How many of you saw that the Maple Laughs lost last night against the Montreal Canadiens? Yes? All right. If you're watching from Toronto, shut this off right now. We don't care. Okay. Kidding. So I'm watching the hockey game with my wife. I'm just watching it, and just, at the end of the day, and I'm just thinking like, oh, I'm ready to go to bed, and I see a commercial about moms. Okay? It's talking about moms and hockey moms, soccer moms, all this stuff. And I'm watching, I'm like, I've never seen a commercial about moms. This is amazing. And then I realized it's not about moms. Guess what it's about? A car. It's about buying a car. So I turned to my wife, I'm like, hey, would you be upset if people used you to sell a product? She's like, oh, this is kind of weird. I'm like, yeah, isn't it powerful? They're actually going to use the identity of moms and the importance of moms to sell a car. And I'm just wondering if any moms, because I'm not a mom, but I'm wondering if any moms would be bothered by this. To be like, this is weird. And I'm like, this is the power of the world that we live in. That we're meant to chase after things without even knowing that we're chasing them. Like, there's a subtle way that the world works that's like, if only you chased this and got that and wanted more of that. And it happens to everyone, including me. all the time. And that's why in the letter Hosea, the prophet Hosea writes, he says you have to be very careful, because there's things that you're going to chase and you're going to think that only if you had that you would be happy. Only if you had that other successful moment it would work. Only if your kids did that, fill in the blank. Only if blank, fill in the blank. Today, it would be okay for you to leave here saying, God, I don't want to live that way anymore. I don't want to live in the only if this happened, I would be happy. Only if this happened, I would pray more. Only if this happened, I would give. Only if. God's like, how about today you decide that my presence is enough now? That you'll learn to be content now with exactly where you are. That you learn to be grateful for who you are and where you are just now. That you would just do that. And that's something that you maybe not even are able to do in your own strength. But you would say, God, help me to not believe the lie. That somehow, if only I got something else, if I only chased after that, I would feel so much happier if I had those things. As a pastor over the years, I've had so many conversations with people. Young people, old people. Oh, Dom, I'll only be, like, when I find the right person to marry, I'll be so happy. Then they get married. I'm like, hey, how's that going? You happy? Well, it's not what I thought. I'm like, I could have told you that, bro. But I have a great wife, I'm just saying. You know, then no, but maybe if we have kids, it's really gonna feel better. I'm like, yeah, sure it is. I'm gonna go now. And you try, and you know what's the most frustrating thing as a pastor? Is that no matter how hard you try, they're like, maybe I just need to feel it for myself. Yeah, you do. Like, you're trying to teach, like, listen, in some ways you have to learn to be grateful for where you are right now. Because that other thing might be special, might be important, might be even a wonderful change. That's beautiful, that's great. But it might not make you happy if already you haven't learned how to be happy with who you are and what God's calling you to now. So many of us are busy chasing something else, and God's just trying to say to us, hey, I was here all along, and I was trying to remind you that I loved you here now. Today, don't leave here without saying, God, I'm not going to fill in the blank with what if I had this, what if I had that. Because Gomer realizes at a point in the story that she's been chasing all these things, and she's like, wait a second, I'll just go back to my husband, he'll take me back. She does that. And Hosea's like, this is kind of like the fabric of worship, and how we really understand what worship means, because worship is not about music. This is what it says in the next part of the passage. I wrap up. It says this: I will punish her for the days she burned incense to the Baals. She decked herself with rings and jewelry and went after her lovers, but me she forgot, declares the Lord. I'm going to invite the team to come back up. And this is one of the parts of Hosea that deals with what it really means to care about worship. And I want to ask you a question before we just sing a song as a way of responding and just saying, God, you need to do some work in us. Because all of us in some ways maybe see part of Gomer in ourselves. It's not just this old book in the Bible, it's not just a funny tale, it's the way humanity works. That Hosea says that there's something about worship when we forget where we've come from that starts to change how we think about ourselves. That Hosea reminds us that all of us are prone to forget where we came from. And I don't mean location. I don't mean you came from another church. I don't mean you came from another province. It's we forget who we used to be before God entered our lives. So take a minute and think about that. If somebody asked you to describe your life the way it was before you understood God's love and before you began to live a life committed to God, and then to ask you to explain your life after, what would you say? How would you explain that? Could you tell your kids that story? Could you tell a neighbor that story? Because oftentimes many people, after a while, you're like, I don't really know. It's kind of the same thing. And when it becomes just a big hodgepodge of the same thing, we're now dealing with religion and not with worship. Because worship is that space where we regularly commit ourselves to letting God transform who we are into new people. If we're not careful, worship becomes a feeling. And if you don't believe me, in a few minutes when the band plays, just ask yourself, how do I feel? Because if you don't feel like you like the song, you're probably not going to sing it. And if you feel sad because it's raining, a lot of people just stay home. We live in a world that measures everything by how we feel. But in the Bible, worship is about how we're formed. If you're writing anything, just remember that. That in our culture, music is about feeling, but in the Bible, worship is about forming. That when we worship, God says to us, let me form you now in a new way. Let me remind you that all the things you chased before, they're never gonna heal the things that are going on inside. And so the words that we sing and the words that come from our heart, forget about even the words on the screen, are times where we say to God, I'm here, and I'm here to worship, and I need you to form something new in me. I need you to form like a new passion and a new vision for my life. I need you to form me from the inside out towards things that are gonna matter. And if we're not careful, stories like Hosea, we read them, we become just like the Israelites. Hey, what feels best? I'll chase the next thing instead of saying, God, there's so many things in my life that I need you to reform and unform in me. See, I have this habit at my house, and I've learned this about myself, that when something's broken or it doesn't work, I just throw it out and I try to find a cheap one on the internet. This is the standard. And sometimes you read about this in the Bible and you're like, God, just get rid of these people and start new. Who cares? And God's like, no. I want my people to know that I'm the God who calls them back and shapes them and forms them in a new way. I can clean the brokenness and I can help them learn to forgive and I can help them to learn to trust.